Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Hopefully you do not still hear an echo. I know folks were hearing an echo, and hopefully that's resolved itself. If you do, please note that in the technical issues box, and we'll do our best to take care of that. So we are all here today for our Educator Effectiveness webinar series. Today's topic is the effective instruction of English language learners. Again, I'm Elizabeth Greniger. I'll be facilitating today's webinar. And joining me, I have Dr. Esther Gava from the Ontario Institute for Studies and Education at the University of Toronto. In just a moment, I'll give you a more detailed introduction of Dr. Gava's background. But before I do that, I want to find out from all of you who you are and the role you serve in. You'll see a poll box come up on your screen, and we'd like you to select the response that best fits. Wonderful to see quite a few teachers joining us today, but lots of other folks as well. I think that this is going to prove to be a very useful webinar for those of you who are working instructionally in classrooms and supporting those who are in classrooms. But there will also be a lot of great background knowledge and research shared that will help anyone who impacts English language learners. Great, so we're going to move right along. As I mentioned, today's featured presenter is Dr. Esther Gava. Esther is a professor in the Department of Applied Psychology and Human Development at the Ontario Institute for Studies and Education at the University of Toronto. The primary focus of Dr. Gava's research is the development of language and literacy skills in children and adults from various linguistic backgrounds. She teaches graduate courses and conducts research on reading in a second language, assessment and intervention in multicultural and bilingual contexts, and cross-cultural perspectives on children's psychological problems. Having studied in Israel, the United States, and Canada, Dr. Gava's background reflects her research interests and includes personal experiences in a variety of cultural and linguistic settings. Dr. Gava has published widely in these areas and has presented her work internationally, as well as serving on numerous advisory, policy, and review committees in the U.S. and in Canada that are concerned with literacy development in culturally and linguistically diverse children and adolescents. She served as a member on the National Literacy Panel convened by the Institute of Education Sciences for the U.S. Department of Education. And in that work, she was a part of a team that conducted a comprehensive evidence-based review of the research literature on the development of literacy among language minority children and youth, and she co-hosted an international conference on reading comprehension in immigrant children. As you can tell, she comes to us with a wealth of experience and background knowledge on this topic. And at this time, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Esther Gava.
Hello there. Thank you for inviting me. Even though I'm not able to see your faces, I hope that I'll be able to maintain animation in my voice. So thank you for coming, and let's get going. So hopefully by the end of this webinar, the following goals and outcomes will have, we've met all of these. We're going to look at what research suggests about the learning of reading in a second language. It's a very complex question, and I will try to look at some of the complexity in a few minutes. We are going to look at different learning needs of younger and older learners, so that's an important aspects when we look at learning to read, and in the first or second language is that there are different needs for younger and older learners. We are going to look at some instructional practices that are relevant, though I would need a whole other talk to just talk more about that. So we'll just touch on that briefly. We're going to discuss ways to support teachers who serve ELLs. And we're also going to look at the latter part of my presentation at some ways we can support ELLs who, in addition to being ELLs, may also have some kind of a learning disability. So let's begin. I'm going to show you in a second an example of a writing sample of a kid who was in grade 4 who was ELL. And what I'll show to you, what I would like you to think about is what are the academic and learning needs of this kid. And one of the questions you also want to think about, well, a number of questions. One of them is how does this sample of writing compare to writing you have seen among ELLs, let's say grade 4 ELLs, and what supports or skills might this student need? So here is the task. Some of you may know it. It's called the Test of Written Language, or TAL. The children see a picture like this one, and it's very intentional, this kind of a picture, so there's no particular prior knowledge that's assumed here. And the children are given 15 minutes to write a story about this picture. So now I'm going to show you an example of this picture, of example of a writing sample. And as I said, it's a grade 4 ELL. So I'll try to keep quiet for a few seconds, and while you look at the writing, think about what do you see, what is the issues, is this typical, what could be done about it. And Elizabeth, you're going to be monitoring this, right?
Yes. To take, and then we'll advance and we'll be putting up a poll for everyone to share their thoughts. So I think what I'd like to do, I'm going to advance and show everyone the question, but then I'm going to go back so you can see the screen with the writing sample. So just to start us out thinking about this topic today, we're curious to find out how you think this activity supports us as educators in learning about students who are English language learners. So I'm going to go back, and then you'll see a poll box come up on the screen. We'll try to make it so you can still see the writing sample and see the poll box. And we'd like you to respond to that question. While folks are typing, I'll use this time to provide a reminder for those of you who may be new to our webinar series. You can use the parking lot to ask any questions or to share ideas and resources as we go through today's session. Esther and I will be sure to attend to those questions the best we can throughout today's webinar and try to address any that are remaining as we get to the end of our 2 hours together. So please do feel free to ask questions and share your thoughts and ideas. So Esther, you see the responses are starting to come in?
Yeah. Okay, so I see people are noticing vocabulary and grammar, background knowledge. We're actually, as I said, we tried this task to keep background knowledge neutral, so all kids, we don't expect any of them will have background knowledge in this particular picture. Gives us an overview what student needs to work on. Phonetic spelling, one of the early people responded to. Grammar definitely keeps popping up. Phonetic spelling. Okay, great.
So the good thing is folks are finding things that help them see into this particular student, but hopefully seeing in general what types of issues you might be dealing with an English language learner at this grade level.
That's right. And I think somebody wrote about learning problems. Like, oh, there's more coming. I cannot use it. Too much stuff is coming. But yes, what the teachers can focus on. So, and one of the things that I will come back to that kid at the end of my talk, because one of the questions that we were asking, in addition to everything that people are responding to now, which is all highly valid, is this typical of a grade 4 writing sample? In other words, if let's say we take 10 ELLs in the classroom, and would that be looked at as an average writing? And one of the things that we are doing in our work, and I'll come back to that later, is to compare the writing of a kid like that to other kids from similar backgrounds. So then we can start to see questions such, and we also look at his reading, for instance, and his phonological awareness, other skills, and so we can start. In fact, what I can tell you is that at the end of the project, and it was a longitudinal project, this kid, we decided he actually was, in addition to being ELL, he also had some severe learning disability, because other children from very similar backgrounds were doing a much better job. So I'm just sort of teasing you a bit about what's coming next. Okay. Elizabeth, can we continue now? I don't know what the...
Yes, we sure can. So we'll pull that poll right off the screen, and we'll get into the next slide.
Good. Okay. So here's another teaser, and if I had a lot of time, I would do it in an interactive manner with you, but since we need to move on, here's an example of an item that I often ask people to say, oh, if you read Russian, you are not allowed to participate. But if you don't read Russian, I ask people, well, what do you think this says? And people who live in North America and know Starbucks, they recognize the background, the kind of lettering, etc. And they say it says Starbucks, even though they don't read Russian. Here's another example, which comes again from my trip to Russia a few years ago. And I asked people, okay, now what does this word say? And since you're all reading and speaking English, I'm assuming that, again, unless you speak Russian, in which case you're not allowed to participate, you would say that it says pektopa, right? So we basically read phonetically, and we sound out each of the letters. In fact, you will all be wrong, because, in fact, what we pronounce as a P, in fact, is an R in Russian. And so what this word says is restaurant. So this is restaurant in Russian. Okay. The reason I'm showing you this slide is so that we appreciate that there's a point in the reading development where when individuals, whether they're young children or older adults who are learning English as a second language, need to recognize the alphabet and recognize what sound or what phoneme each of these letters make, and we can't take it for granted that they know. And I can tell you that when I was in Russia, each time I saw the words I tried to read, I always made mistakes because I was using my knowledge of English, and so I would commit errors, which we would call negative transfer. In other words, my knowledge of English was somehow interfering with my ability to read accurately and fluently words in Russian. And the point is that you can read a word so that even if you don't know what they mean. And we'll come back to that point in a few minutes again. Okay, so the terminology that I'm going to be using throughout the rest of this afternoon, let's just kind of learn some new words here so I don't have to define them each time, just in case I'm not familiar. So L2 is a reference to second language, L1 is first language or home language, ESL, English as a second language, and more recently we've been referring to learners as English language learners, so that's ELL. And the last one that I may be referring to is EL1, which again refers to English as a first language or home language or societal language. And each of those definitions, we can spend hours on debating it, but this is not the objective of today's talk, so let's just take it as a common ground here. Okay. Before I delve into the kind of research that I've been doing on the development of language and reading in second language learners, I think it may be useful to look at some linguistic and demographic elements of when we teach students English to read and to speak, both either whether it's the U.S. or Canada or any other country, in fact. So, for instance, I can tell you this comes from Canada, but I believe it's equally relevant to the United States. We have students who are English as a second language, or sometimes we have third and fourth language. We've got some immigrants who may speak two different languages at home, and then, in fact, English is their third language. We have, in fact, we're about to get a lot of refugees from Syria. Well, many of these kids actually had interrupted schooling because of the war, and so they haven't gone to school on a regular basis. So they may arrive in grade 7, but in fact they have missed 3 or 4 years of schooling. Then we have the other spectrum in terms of privilege. We have bilingual day schools where children learn 2 different languages at the same time. We have immersion programs. So, for instance, in Canada, we are known for French immersion, which is a public education program that enables kids to become English-French bilingual. We also have some Chinese immersion schools at the moment, and I'm assuming and so on. And then we have international languages. In fact, one of the questions that I got ahead of time had to do with international languages. So, for instance, in Toronto, where I live, we have an increasing number of high school students are being sent from places like China and Korea to do their high school education in Toronto, so that they will be more likely to be accepted to a North American English-speaking university. We can also look at English in terms of the various dialects that one speaks, whether it's one from the Caribbean or from Toronto or from New York. And we have Aboriginal people who speak various languages, and some of them have a writing system and some don't have a writing system. So when we talk about second language learners, it's a very broad umbrella which has all these different kinds of learners, and different groups have different challenges and different advantages, so we can't always generalize. At the same time, there's some basic elements which I hope I'll be able to share with you, which are true regardless of the language context. So let's look first a little bit then at some of the demographic and policy considerations, and what I would like you to, and this is just a snippet of some interesting facts which I thought would be relevant for today's talk. And what I would like you to do is think about why policy and demographic considerations are important to consider when we tackle this issue of learning to read in second language. So here's one. This comes from the statistics I'm providing you are from the United States. So in fact, the number of ELLs in the United States in the early 2000s was about 8.7% altogether. And in 2011-12, so about nine years later, it was about 9.1%, so a slight increase, but not a huge increase. About 1 in 10 U.S. counties in the United States is more than 50% minority language. ELLs in the United States represent more than 150 languages, so not just Spanish. In 28 of the states, more than 2/3 of the ELLs speak Spanish at home, and Spanish is the most common home language of ELLs overall, but it is not the most common in every state. And what that reflects, and that's also true from Canada, is it reflects various immigration trends. So maybe all the immigrants who come from Syria now will settle in 1 or 2 of the cities or 1 or 2 of the states, and they will not be just spread evenly. So some places will have to tackle issues around immigrants who speak Arabic at home, but not all states or all counties will. Here's another interesting slide. This one shows the top 10 states in which children 5 years or older speak a language other than English at home, and we see that California is leading with 43% of the children actually not speaking English as their first language, and then it varies from state to state, and these are just the top 10. And of course, and what you see in the United States is some of the states that in the past did not have to address at all issues of ELLs now are facing increasing number of people who speak languages other than English, and they have to, or Spanish, and they have to tackle the challenges. Here's another one which I think is highly relevant to today's talk, and in particular I want to highlight the second column from the left. So that's the one where there's an arrow pointing to it, and that's where we start to look at some of the additional problems. So for instance, about a quarter of the students in the United States who go to high school who are ELLs drop out and don't finish high school. So that's a serious problem, and that's one of the reasons this is an important topic to address in various ways. Here's one. This slide is showing actually information that comes from British Columbia, and I'm going to take you to the slides slowly. So first, if you look at the lower line, which is blue, and that one, if you look on the left, it says 7, and on the right it says 13. So 7 means that these are children who came to Canada when they're 7 years old, and about 75% of them actually graduated high school in 4 years. As you see, as you move your eye to the right, and you look at where it says 13, we see that children who come to in this case, to British Columbia, when they were 13 years old, only about 60% of them were likely to finish high school. So in other words, this is telling us that just by the mere fact of when, it's not just that where you're ELL or not an ELL, or where you're officially recognized as ELL or not anymore, that there's a direct relationship between how many years you've been living in the United States and your likelihood of finishing high school. The red line, which is above the blue line, is kind of cool because I think it shows what sometimes can happen if the state takes upon itself to change slightly policy. In this case, British Columbia, for a while, they allowed high school students to stay an extra year in high school. And what the red line shows is what happens if the students actually can stay an extra year in high school, how many of them are likely to finish, to actually graduate from high school. And we see that the red line is consistently higher than the blue line. In other words, if you have issues with learning English, with learning to read and speak English and handling academic materials, if you're given an extra year, you're much more likely to finish high school. And that is true regardless of the age at which you arrived. Okay, so I think that, Elizabeth, I'm moving now to giving the stage to you for a minute.
Yes, ma'am. So now that Esther's had a chance to kind of lay out the demographics and where we are and where we stand with some of the data on English language learners, we want to open it up and find out from all of you how you think these demographics affect the instruction of English language learners. So from your experience, what does this data tell you, and how does it impact the teaching and learning that happens with this group of students? So we're going to put up another poll. We'll give you a few moments to formulate some ideas and post them there. While we're doing that, I'll address a little bit of housekeeping on the parking lot. I know someone was asking about having a recording of the webinar, and yes, we do in fact provide a recording of this webinar. It will take a week or a little longer for that to be posted, but you will, because you are a participant in today's webinar, you will receive an email that indicates when that's ready. And you can find all of our past webinars archived on the Rel Mid-Atlantic site, and at any point in time, whatever you see there, you can share with colleagues, you can direct them to our resources, and hopefully invite them to a future event. So that is the answer to one question. We do quite often have folks who are interested in finding out about the transcripts from the parking lot and from the polls that we're asking, so we will make those available. A lot of times later on in the session, we'll probably be seeing a lot of sharing of resources, so you'll see some good ideas there, and we'll make sure to capture that for y'all. And I'll also reiterate that the bottom resources to download box has a copy of today's PowerPoint and has an additional set of materials that are graphs that are included in today's webinar that will be kind of blown up, so that if you can't see them quite as clearly on your PowerPoint version, they're there for you. All right, so turning back to our poll and how do demographics affect the instruction of ELLs, we have a few responses coming in here.
Yeah, So I see we need more time, we need professional development, absolutely. Low expectations, absolutely. You took away one of the points I was going to make in a minute. Yeah.
Interesting, because an awareness of the demographics can really help shape and influence policy and decisions about timelines, maybe at the district or the school level.
Mm-hmm. Access to education in the home country, absolutely. I'm going to talk a little about that in a few minutes. Yes, instructional reality is complex. You bet it is. SES, yes. Major factor, definitely. We'll touch about it in a few minutes when I show you sort of a comprehensive model that tries to pull on all these issues. Demographics, yeah.
That's an interesting point. Angeline's comment here that these demographics should really be considered when districts are considering hiring.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I can say while people are responding, that as a consumer of research, and of course a lot of the excellent research on these issues comes from the United States, but I find that most of the time, most of the research deals with issues around Latina children, and which is of course very important, but you have in the States over 150 other different languages being spoken, and so sometimes the information, the resources that are available for Spanish speakers are not useful when you have somebody who speaks Arabic or Chinese, for instance. So it's not so simple. Yeah. Yeah, high school, definitely entering high school is a challenge. And as somebody said, if you are from an upper middle class family in your home country, maybe even if you come into high school, you may have more home resources to help you. We have a program actually in Toronto that I've been involved in where high school students come to an after-school club where they get help from volunteers and doing their schoolwork. And that has been highly successful. And the name of the program is Pathways to Education, and this is a highly vulnerable area of Toronto called Regent Park. And it turns out that those children, just because somebody is helping them with their homework, whether it could be math or geography or English, they are much more likely to finish high school. So that's an example of what can be done.
Great. So I see a few more people are trying to get some responses in there. We'll leave that up for a couple more seconds, but we will prepare ourselves to be ready to move into the research section. And so, Esther, you'll move into thinking more about what the research tells us on this topic.
That's right. There's just one thing I see that Kelly talks about emotional needs, and that absolutely is essential, but I will just not be touching on it today because there's so much time that we can do it, but it's a very important point as well. Okay, so we'll move on, okay? Can we move on, Elizabeth?
Yep, we're going to move that poll right off and let you get into the next section.
All right. So we're shifting gear now, and in what's going to happen from now on, I'm going to be talking about some general models of learning to read and reading comprehension, and then I'm going to be sharing you some research. The first part will focus on normal development, typical development of ELLs, and the second part will focus on sort of this amalgamation of being ELL and maybe also having a learning disability. So that's the general structure, what's going to happen in the next, I don't know, maybe hour. We'll see when Elizabeth will tell me to stop talking. Okay, so when we look at general principles that entail to learning to read in the second language, that one of the things that I would say that There is some research that's coming primarily from the United States, actually focusing on Latino children, that suggests that students who first learn to read in their first language, that can help to promote higher levels of reading achievement in English. And so there's some support for this, primarily, as I said, coming from the United States. In some other countries, other models are being used. But regardless of this, one of the things that we know, and that was actually mentioned in one of the points that one of the participants said, is that we need to have high expectations. Just because somebody doesn't speak English well or speaks with a heavy accent doesn't mean that they're not smart and they cannot learn. There is a need to engage the learners, of course, in a way that's age-appropriate in academic discussion, in repeating ideas. And again, that's a question that somebody sent yesterday about explicit instruction, and definitely what we know is that explicit and intensive language instruction is important, even though it is true that individuals also can learn incidentally, but it's important to make specific elements explicit when students are learning in the second language. And on the whole, just having high expectations and engaging in language, in a meaningful language in a variety of ways is very important. So we don't want to teach down. We don't want to only teach immigrant kids to decode words and not to engage with big ideas. And at the same time, we have to be aware of the language demands of what they have to read. And okay, so another principle that again, I think that in the United States there's a lot of work is being done on this. It has to do with differentiated instruction, and the way it's relevant to monolingual kids is also relevant for ELLs. There's no need to distinguish between the two. It works equally well. Some people have done work on cooperative learning, and to show that these are some of the strategies where you can implement principles at the classroom level, where you pull together kids in terms of who can into smaller groups, which are constructed on the basis of their ability, or in fact, where in each group you have kids who are more able, for instance, better speakers, and those are poor. So the poor learners are exposed to good language instead, because if you always put the poor speakers together, they don't actually learn much from each other. So these are some of the principles of cooperative learning, but again, it's not something that I will dwell on today a lot, because that's not the focus of my talk. And so, importance to integrate language with content of instruction is important. So what are the words that are being selected to teach are a crucial consideration. And for students to help each other engage in meaningful language. And there are some references here, some excellent references for a much more elaborate discussion of the points I just raised. So as Elizabeth said, I live in Toronto, and that's where I do my research. Now, some of you may not know this, so I think it's relevant for the context in which I'm doing my research. Toronto has a population of about 5.5 million people, so it's the largest city in Canada. 46% of the Toronto population are foreign-born. So if you think about it, if you walk downtown Toronto, 1 in 2 people was not born in Canada. That's a lot. So Toronto is a mosaic of many languages, over 140 languages spoken, and it's considered one of the most multicultural cities in the world. So that's the context in which I do my work. So it's not a context where everybody only speaks Spanish. Okay? So when you walk into a classroom, you may have in the same classroom kids coming from 15 different countries. So you cannot teach them one language. So this slide basically provides sort of an overview of what I'm going to be trying to do in the rest of my talk. So at the beginning, I'm going to describe to you what does normal development look like when we look at ELLs. I will also address the question of transfer, which is very often used by people, and sometimes people use it as the only explanation of why things happen or not happen. So an example might be, okay, this kid, they speak Chinese at home, so it's hard for this kid to learn to read English because the Chinese language is very different than the English language. So that would be an example where people are explaining what would, in this case, will be an example of a negative transfer. In other words, that because you speak Chinese at home, that language is very different from English, and that's why it's hard for you to learn English. So that we'll address that a little bit, because of shortage of time. We're going to look at other factors that contribute to what we call individual differences between learners in terms of their memory, in terms of motivation. Somebody mentioned emotional issues, in terms of home language. But what I mean by typology is how different languages may vary from each other, both in terms of the oral language and in terms of the written language. So in terms of, if we think about Chinese English, for instance, where both the writing system is very different and the spoken language is different, but that does not mean that there aren't some commonalities between Chinese and English in terms of some specific ways in which words are formed. As an example. At the same time, we take English, Spanish. We have languages which both the writing system is the same, more or less, and if we think of the way we make words in English and Spanish, there's many more commonalities. So this is an example where we would expect to see what we call positive transfer between the two languages. I will also touch briefly on instruction interventions that can promote reading achievement, and I will, as I said, I will also look at the issue of teasing apart the second language learners who may also have an LD. So is it just as typical as second language learning, or is this also a learning disability? So the research that I'll be talking to you about today, that I'll be sharing with you today, is a study where we took us 10 years to collect our data. And what we did is we went to grade 1 in 13 schools, and we tested ELLs who were in grade 1 and EL1s, monolinguals, who were in the same classrooms, and we tested them once a year on a variety of measures. I'll show that to you in a minute. So we actually had information about how these children developed their reading and language skills and their cognition over 6 years. And the areas where we looked at, most of the parents were poor, their immigrants tended to be poor, and the language that was spoken in those areas were Punjabi, Tamil, Urdu, Cantonese, Portuguese, and Spanish. And one of you might ask, why these languages? It's because these were the languages that were spoken when we were collecting the data. That's where immigration was coming from. So we just addressed the demographic profile that was available at the time. I think that if I had collected the data today in Toronto, we have many more people, for instance, who speak Spanish, many more than we had when we collected the data. I would have many more kids from the Philippines and from Arabic-speaking countries. So it just reflects demographic trends in the world. Okay. So another thing that I'm trying to show you on this slide is usually people talk about, okay, now we're going to talk about speaking, and now we're talking about listening, and now we're talking about writing, now we're talking about reading. And of course, it's useful to think about each of those as a component, but they're highly related to each other. And in what follows, I'm not going to talk about this in this kind of a way. But definitely each of those has all sorts of sub-skills. So when we talk about speaking, we have to know the vocabulary, we have to know how to pronounce words, we have to know the grammar. When we're listening, likewise, when you're listening to me now, you probably hear a slight Hebrew accent and mixed with some other languages that I speak. And you're paying attention to the words, you're paying attention to the grammar, you're paying attention to when my voice rises and falls, etc. So you're taking this all in and you're integrating all that to comprehend what I'm saying. Reading, well, we'll talk about it in a minute. And writing, we're not going to touch on today because, again, there's not enough time. Even otherwise, I would have. So let's move on. So these are the tests that we gave the children every year. So in the top left-hand corner, we see cognitive linguistics. So we looked at the kids' nonverbal ability. We look at the rapid naming and phonological awareness, which are two of the elements that we know from other research are very important for learning to read words and spell words. So individuals who can very quickly pull out of memory names of letters or names or the digits or colors, that kind of a skill is highly related to the ability to learn to read words and to spell words. Phonological awareness is another one, which I will mention in a minute. in more detail, memory, auditory discrimination. So all these are part of the cognition of individuals, and people vary from each other. And so when we are trying to understand why somebody is reading well, not reading well, we may find some of the explanation in sort of what's in one's head, so to speak. The other cluster on the right looks at oral language, and we assess the kids' language in a variety of ways. We looked at their vocabulary knowledge, both breadth and depth. I'll talk about it a bit more in a minute. We looked at their grammatical knowledge. We looked at their ability to listen to stories and comprehend them. So we look at the small units, if you wish, and you also looked at the large units. And all these, of course, together make what we mean by oral language proficiency. In the left upper corner, we have another cluster. This has to do with word-level skills. So the ability to decode unfamiliar words, the ability to read familiar words with ease. So accuracy and speed, that's where the fluency comes in, and the ability to spell words. And then the other part is kind of looking at the big context, at the big discourse. So here we're looking at reading comprehension. We're looking at the ability to read text with fluency, and the ability to write stories, which, as I said, I'm not going to talk about more today because there's not time. Okay, so this is what we tested every year for 6 years. Okay. So what I would like to do now, before I start to share with you some of the results of this research, is to help you to kind of think in terms of some big theoretical frameworks that are all relevant to how we try to understand what happens when you're learning to read. So one framework, which some of you may be familiar with, is the benchmark that were proposed by Jean Scholl many years ago. And the other one is this transfer framework. The other one is the simple view of reading. And finally, I'm going to propose kind of a comprehensive framework at the end. So this is not going to be heavy on theory, but I believe that as users, it's helpful if you think of those frameworks so that you don't always explain difficulties on the basis of one of those frameworks. It could be that sometimes it's a number of frameworks that work together, and it's not only about transfer, and it's not only about being able to read words. Sometimes it's both of those together. So here's the first framework, and there's only one slide associated with that here, and it's Jean Scholl's framework. So she, in general, talked about sort of three, what I would call milestones or periods in the development of reading. She looked at that in particular with regard to children. So the first one is what she called getting ready. So this is the kind of development that happens that's before children actually learn to read, but they are getting the tools that kind of prepare them for the next stage. So it's a pre-reading, so preschool to kindergarten and usually birth to 6. So just to give an example of what I mean by that, my granddaughter who lives in Chicago, when she was 4 years old, she held a book and she turned it one way and she says, now I'm reading English. And then she turned it around to the other side, the other way, and she said, now I'm reading Hebrew. So that, of course, she did not read at that time neither Hebrew nor English, but she already had a sense that one language you read from in one direction, another language you read in the other direction. So that would be a good example of what we mean by this pre-reading or getting ready stage. Or when you see children who look at pictures and they tell a story, or sometimes they just follow their fingers and they don't actually read yet, but they already know that the scribbles on the page tell words and they kind of follow with their fingers. So all these would be examples of what we mean by pre-reading. Then typically in grades 1 or 2, sometimes already in senior kindergarten, we start to see then what we call the learning to read stage, where children start to recognize the letters, they recognize what sounds the letters make, they may recognize certain words which they see a lot in their neighborhood, like the word stop and Coca-Cola. So even though they cannot read other words, but they can already start to recognize some environmental prints, they may be able to write their name. So these are all examples of what is emerging here. And then what happens in grade 2 typically is that the decoding skills are starting to be more established, and then we start to see also fluency and what Jean Chol called ungluing from the print. So you stop just reading letter by letter, but there are at least some words that we can read with fluency because you've seen them many times and you remember what they look like. Typically, around grade 4, there's this transition to what Jean talked about, learning to read. Reading to learn, excuse me. So learning to read is the early years, and then reading to learn is the later years. And this, again, can be unpacked from many components, including the use of strategies, developing different multiple viewpoints, and learning and using the internet to write a project on the solar system. So any of those would be an example where we are using our reading skills to learn from the various resources that are available to us, and so on. So this is sort of just a very brief overview, but I find that most people, even if they are not reading researchers, they really like this kind of distinction between learning to read and reading to learn. It makes a lot of intuitive sense, and you don't have to be a teacher or a professor to understand that. The other framework that I wanted to mention just briefly is this transfer, which I already touched on a little bit a few minutes ago. And so when we look at this notion of transfer, when people who are involved with second language learners, the issue, and that actually was reflected in some of the questions that people sent yesterday, is this notion of can you use what you know in one language to help you in the other language, or alternatively, could it be the deterrent? So the linguistic interdependence hypothesis, which was proposed by Jim Cummins, who, by the way, is from OIZ, from Toronto, he talked about the fact that if you have well-developed language skills and reading skills in your first language, you can use that when you learn it in the second language. And that actually is the basis of some of the programs that you have in the United States, where the idea is that let's teach the children first to read and speak well Spanish, and then they'll be able to use all those skills when they move to English. And Jim also talked about the fact that there's some shared cognitive processes. So an example of what he talked about is if you already have well-developed reading strategies for how to, for instance, find out the main idea in the text, and if you know how to do that in Arabic, then as soon as you know how to speak well English and read enough English, you should be able to do that also, to be able to look for main ideas in English as well. If you already understand that reading means that you have to find out the main idea, you don't have to learn it again when you learn another language. It's a cognitive skill. It's already part of what you know. And as soon as you speak enough of the other language, you should be able to do that. So these are examples of the linguistic interdependence. Now I'm going to move to another framework, which is complementary. It's not either or. And that's the one where we compare systems so that earlier, for instance, I juxtaposed Chinese with English. Or we can juxtapose English with Spanish. And so we were looking to see what are the elements of the first language that help or confuse when you learn to the second language. There's quite a bit of research on this, and I'm not going to talk about this anymore today because we can't do it all. And I want to emphasize that these two perspectives are complementary. So if you already are good, if you have arrived from Sweden and you're a good reader and you recognize the alphabet, and it should be the case as soon as you learn how to speak English and recognize the words in English, that you should be able to also do okay when you learn to read English. And likewise, if we take what Jim Cummins was talking about, if you're a very good reader in Chinese, then we would not expect you to be a poor reader in English. What you need is to learn to read and speak the language, and then you'll be able to use what you already know in your first language. At the same time, it's possible you haven't had the opportunity to do that, and we will talk about it in a few minutes. So let's move on. This one is what's called a simple view of reading. It's pretty prevalent in the current research that people are doing. And the simple view of reading basically says that in order to comprehend well, you have to have two clusters of skills that have to work together. What we see on the left is all the different components of what we think about as making up language. And on the right in blue is all the different components that go into being able to read words fluently. So let's look at the red for a minute. That's a language component. So we have knowing the meaning of the words, syntax, and this has to do with grammar, phonology, being able to distinguish the different sounds in the language, linguistic knowledge in general, and comprehension. So do you understand the story I'm telling you in English? So all these kind of go together on this language component. On the right, we have the word reading. And here again, we start with concepts of print, so that, for instance, knowing how to hold the book, knowing that the scribbles on the page each go with a word. We also then want the kind of things that we just talked about a minute ago with regard to Jean Scholl, so recognizing letters. These are the things that happen in SK, recognizing letters, knowing what sound each of the letters make, and recognizing, for instance, in English that the TH sound combination makes a th sound. So all these kind of work together to help individuals to learn to decode words with ease and hopefully also with fluency. So the simple view of reading basically is a very powerful framework, and it has been supported both for monolingual and for second language learners in a variety of different countries, including India and China, and with different groups of second language learners in studies that were done in Canada and the United States. And basically what it's saying is to comprehend well that these two sets of clusters are very, very important. In fact, they're more important than cultural knowledge or prior knowledge. So if you know, if you have enough of the language, if you have good decoding skills, you should comprehend text better than if one of those you have problems with. And cultural knowledge is not going to help you that much. Much more important to focus on the language and the decoding skills. So this is what the simple view of reading says. And again, let me emphasize that it's developmental, so some of those skills are learned early, some of them are learned slightly later in elementary school. The other thing that we have learned from lots of research that other people have done is that sometimes you can figure out the meaning of a word by understanding, learning its meaning from the context in which you're, for instance, listening to a story. So in this case, language comprehension in general may help you to figure out the meaning of a particular word that you are not familiar with. Okay. So the last framework is one that actually I put together in a book that we published earlier this year. And what I would like to do is just point out, and again, it reflects some of the questions that you sent both today and yesterday. So what you were saying, okay, what do we know from the research about what helps individuals to comprehend well when they're learning to read in second language, and what are at the same time, or that may hinder them? So the green and the blue in the middle are more or less the simple view of reading that we've just looked at. The only thing that we have added here is the reading fluency, which the simple view of reading did not include. Otherwise, it's more or less the same. What we have on the left side are some contextual factors that may matter. So one is, for instance, family literacy. Well, you know, if your father is a professor in university, it may be easier for you to learn to read a second language than if your family is illiterate or can barely read. Of course, family literacy matters. If we look on the right side, on the orange, also what matters is instruction. So, and again, we can talk for hours about that. How do you teach? What is the quality of the teaching? What kind of materials are being used? What kind of, is decoding being taught, or is the focus only on comprehension and not on decoding? So all sorts of these questions that can be unpacked when we talk about instruction. What kind of school are you going to? Are you going to school where everybody speaks only one language? For instance, what we have in north of Toronto is an area, it's a middle class area where most of the people are from China, but they're middle class. And so when these kids go to the playground, they speak Chinese to each other. At the same time, you go to other schools where the children speak 15 different languages. So the common language on the playground is not going to be Chinese, but English. So these are some examples I'm just giving of school and how it's organized and how it matters. Policies, well, we talked about policies already earlier. And neighborhood, actually some very nice research is coming from the United States about neighborhoods where there's so much poverty and the children are not exposed to literacy at all, whereas in other areas there's lots of libraries and bookstores and posters on the walls, etc. So the kids are exposed to language. So all these matter. And then at the bottom are some things, again, you mentioned some of them, motivation and attitude, so also the affective issues. The L1 literacy is an important one as well. So the question we're really asking here is to what extent you're already reading the first language. So if you're already a good reader, a good decoder in your first language before you come to the United States, you'll be starting at a different point than if you haven't ever learned to read in your first language. Background knowledge is important in cognition. So this is an attempt to kind of pull it all together. And now we're going to start to look at some of the results. Elizabeth, do you want to take a break, or shall we go on?
Yes, Esther, actually we have a question in the parking lot that's really relevant to what you were just speaking about. Angel asking, I think as we've gone through the last several slides, this is probably something that many people are thinking about. So Angel is presenting us with a situation where she has a student in her class that I guess 2 grades below in reading and math within the child's own language. So
yes. So
what do you do with that type of situation?
Yeah. So this is a kind of an example. In fact, we are working with kids like that in our clinic here at OISE. We have children who have performed below where they should be. Below, not only in English, but also in the first language. One of the first questions that I would ask is, when did this child arrive in the United States or wherever it is that you are, Angel? Has the child arrived 3 years ago or half a year ago? The reason I think that that's an important question is that if we know that it's useful to look to see how the children do in their first language. But if they have been, let's say, living in New Jersey for the last 3 years, then they actually are not developing anymore the skills in their first language, whichever it is. So then even though it's useful to find out what they can do in their first language, but in fact, we cannot compare them anymore to children in the home country. Whereas if they've arrived more recently, then it would make more sense to say, well, how is this kid doing in comparison to other children from their home language? So that's one of the challenges that, yes, we do look at the first language, but it's important to know when the child has arrived and whether they have been exposed to the home language until recently. Math, again, one of the questions I would ask is, yes, people believe that math is not related to language, but in fact math is related to language. To solve word problems, you need to know the language. And there are some specific ways we talk about math, which if you're second language learners may be a challenge. So again, I would need to know when the child has arrived. At the same time, it's useful. One of the things that we do when we do assessments here, we also look at the report cards. So was there already a flagging of problems in the home language, in comprehension, let's say, in math skills? So we pull all these sources together. And the other thing which we do when we do assessments here is we also use dynamic assessment approaches, such as curriculum-based measurement, and some kind of the RTI approaches that I think are being developed in the United States as well to see how the child is learning. So I hope that addressed somehow your question, Angel. I can talk more about this. And in fact, in the book that we just published recently, we have a whole chapter just on this issue that you're raising. Okay, so shall we move on?
Yes, ma'am. I think that that's a good start to that kind of conundrum that many might feel and be experiencing. So let's move into the next slide. I think what we have here is just a few hypothetical questions, and then we're going to get right into a poll to talk with folks and hear some responses about how some of this might impact their work in classrooms. So do you want to go through this list of questions here, Esther?
Yeah, sure. So imagine that you're teaching reading to grade 6 students, and here are some very likely kids who are sitting in the same classroom. So what might be the specific challenges faced by a newcomer from China and somebody who's come from Mexico who are sitting in your same classroom? So it's definitely something that happens in Toronto all the time, and I'm sure it does in many places, the states as well. Will they be struggling with the same issues when they learn to read English? Will they be benefiting from similar aspects of their first language reading skills? Will you need to adapt your teaching strategies to meet the needs of each of those students, and how would you go about it? So these are some questions. Let's see what people think.
Okay, so we're going to put the poll question up. How might a teacher adapt teaching strategies to address the unique backgrounds of all students in the classroom? So those questions were kind of a primer for maybe some experiences you all might be having, scenarios you might be experiencing, or you may have your own specific scenario to draw from. So we'll put that poll up and we'll give you a few minutes to gather some ideas. Dr. Geva, Esther, there's a question in the technical issues box. If you can restate the title of your recent book, and we can.
I actually did not. I did not state it, so it's not a technical problem. It appears at the end of your handout, and the name of there are actually two. In fact, there are two books that I published this year. One is focusing on individuals who have learning difficulties, and the other one focuses on sort of the typical classroom. And so the reference to both of those appear at the end of your slides.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yep.
So vocabulary mapping, maybe identifying the word in each language. Okay, so the word, identifying the word in each language of students in the classroom. Learning the alphabet in English. Yes, so that will be for the Chinese student. Yeah, absolutely. Collaborative groups so the students can help each other. Lots of visuals. That's always useful. Absolutely. Illustrations. So yeah, some of those are just good general principles. They're not necessarily highlight the challenges between the differences between the Chinese-speaking, the Spanish-speaking kid. Culture. The methods of teaching in China, rote, so it's about rote teaching, okay. So I guess the assumption here is that when children are used to rote learning in China, that they may have difficulty with an open-ended learning in that we use here. That's absolutely true. But I would say about the rote learning, one of the things, and there is research on that shows that because of the writing system in Chinese, Chinese children memorize how words look like. And so sometimes when they come to places like Toronto, I've seen that happen, they memorize the words. They don't learn how to decode them. They memorize how they look. And I can tell you I was working on a grant proposal with a Chinese colleague just 2 months ago, and I gave her a nonsense word in English, and she could not read it. And that was exactly the point, that she remembers how words look like, but she has never learned to decode. And clearly, to learn to read in English, we will need to also teach them how to decode, whether they've arrived in grade 3 or whether they arrived in grade 9. RAPs, study groups. Familiar with this home language and culture, definitely. Lots of visuals, okay. Graphic organizers. Okay, these are all generic good strategies. Music. Okay, good. Okay, and then Lauren talks about how much they know of the L1. Okay. And again, as we said, that some of those kids come from illiterate backgrounds, which may be very different from parents who are highly literate. Cognate, okay. So cognate is, but Angeline, I wish you had have said cognate can help Spanish speakers, but it cannot help Chinese speakers, right? So a lot is, if you teach a lot of Spanish-speaking kids, then of course there's cognates can help, but there are no cognates between Chinese and English. So that'd be one place where you just can't tell them, use your cognates. What cognates are they going to use? There's one more thing I want to say about cognates. There is research, actually very nice research that's come from the United States. Some of it was done at the University of Illinois, which has shown that young children actually are just not aware of cognates. So you actually have to point out to them that there are cognates, that a certain word that they know in Spanish, for instance, is very similar to the same word in English. If they're young, they don't figure it out on their own. So that's something for you to, one kind of take-home message, I would say, is that cognates need to be pointed out. They need to be explicit, made explicit. Okay.
I think that point on, cognates are helpful for students who are Spanish-speaking versus not helpful with Chinese-speaking or potentially another language. I think that that's a helpful big picture message, because you mentioned this before, but depending on where our schools are located in the context in which our communities where we're working, we might have a population of primarily Spanish speakers. So there are certain strategies that might be more prevalent or more useful versus a community where we have a variety of languages. So I know you touched on that earlier, that you really were talking today about general strategies that are useful for all English language learners.
Yeah, that are useful for all, and at the same time become aware that some of the strategies may be relevant to certain groups and not relevant to others because their language is very different, either in the writing system or in the sort of the history of where the language comes from. So you can't tell an Arabic-speaking kid, use your cognates when you're learning English. Because there are no cognates between English and Arabic, right?
Right, and of course you've mentioned it, but a lot of the recommendations here and the thoughts that folks have been posting are really just good quality literacy instruction, and for English, for monolingual students.
Everybody.
Yes, so there's sort of parsing out, what is appropriate for students who are learning English as their second language, and what is just good instruction in general.
Absolutely. That's an excellent summary. I couldn't have done it any better, Elizabeth. Thank you. Okay.
Okay, well, we have a lot to cover still, so I'm going to move this off the screen, and we're going to get into the next section where we talk more in detail about some of the specific areas, starting with vocabulary.
Yes. So we'll start with vocabulary. So I just thought that for those of you who are not familiar with tests, this is an example of how we might test vocabulary when we do research. So this is an example from a test called the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, and the children see these 4 containers, and the experimenter or the tester says empty, and the child has to point to the one that shows empty. Hopefully they point option number 2. So that's just an example of how we assess it. One of the ways we assess it, so it makes it more meaningful for those of you who are not familiar with testing. So what I'm going to show you here, remember we followed these children for 6 years, from grade 1 to grade 6. And what I'm showing you here in this particular chart, at the bottom you see it says grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, and so on until grade 6, because we use the same test, on consecutive 6 years. What we see on where it says vocabulary, or the y-axis, is how many words on average these children were able to point to words such as empty. And of course some of the words are much more difficult and some of them are much easier than the word empty. So I would like to point out to 2 or 3 important points that we found. First of all, okay, the red line describes the average of this very large sample of 450 or 460 kids that we had, and it shows the average of correct vocabulary, of how many vocabulary items they know in grade 1 and so on. And the blue one shows the same thing from the monolingual kids, the EL1 kids. What I'm showing you here with this orange circle is that in grade 1, and that's not surprising, there's a big difference between the average number of words in English that is known by the ESL kids and the monolingual children. And it's a fairly large difference, and of course it's to be expected. The other thing that we saw in this particular study was in the first few years, I should say one thing that I did not mention before, that in Canada in general, and I'm talking in particular about metropolitan Toronto, the common language of instruction is English. So we don't have the kind of schools that you have in some certain areas of the United States where the children are first being taught, let's say, Spanish, and only gradually they move into English. And that's because there's not one common language, so other than English. Okay, so that should be clear that they're only being taught in English. And so what we see is that there's a big difference in grade 1. The other thing that we see is that over time, I don't know if you can see that, but the red line is steeper until about grade 3 or 4. And what this is showing us that actually those ELL kids, they're learning more new words in the first few years. It's because they don't come with no English, and they're suddenly exposed to English for 5-6 hours a day, and they're learning a lot of new words. So that's a good story. Of course, at the same time, the monolingual kids continue to develop their vocabulary as we would expect. The interesting thing is that even in grade 6, so now it's 6, that these kids have been now in school in Canada, in an English-speaking school, for at least 6 years. And still, on average, the monolingual children know more words in English than the ESL kids. And this is a very strong result, and it's something that should make, we can talk about this for many hours, and I'm sure some of the questions you sent me yesterday had to do with this. That even when these kids are not recognized anymore as an ESL, because they may be getting ESL help for 2 years, formal help with their English. 6 years later, they don't get any special help. And they may sound very fluent, and they may also have no accent, because if children start to learn the second language early, they often lose their heavy accent. So they have no accent or just very slight accent, but they still know, on average, fewer words in English than do the monolingual children. And that's a very important take-home message. So you may be having in your class some kids who have been in the country for a number of years, and that maybe they're doing fine academically, but if you look at how many words they know in comparison to the monolingual children, they may know fewer words. And that is important, because if you remember when we talked, for instance, about a simple view of reading, we said that to comprehend well, you have to know a lot of words. So it's possible that one of the reasons that they're being challenged with reading comprehension and with their writing is that even though they're not recognized anymore as ESL, but still the vocabulary is not as strong as their monolingual counterparts. So that's what this graph is showing. Now, when we look at language, we can, and vocabulary, right now I'm talking just about vocabulary, we can distinguish between what we call everyday vocabulary and academic vocabulary. So you may see individuals, including maybe some of the parents of the children you're working with, who on everyday language, they are fine, they can express themselves clearly, they don't make any major grammatical errors. The issue is that we care about, and that's a very important thing that I want to emphasize in my talk today, is that it's about academic language, where they are poorer, and I'll show you an example in a minute. So academic language has to do with talking, reading, and writing about abstract concepts, or those not related to personal experience, and it's the kind of words that one is much more likely to encounter when you learn, when you're reading to learn. And it could be whether you read it on the internet or whether you listen to a program on television, but it's about the kind of language, it's not about the here and now. And that's where this is very important. Having academic vocabulary is what's really important for reading comprehension. So one of the things that people like Jim Cummins talked about is that it takes 5 to 7 years to develop academic language. And that's sort of a finding that often people cite, but I think it's probably too conservative, that maybe, in fact, may take even longer. And one of the things, again, it refers to some of the questions people sent both today and yesterday. Academic vocabulary should be taught in a meaningful context. So for instance, in the context of the social sciences, so they don't just, so they are embedded in meaning, but they need to be taught explicitly. The other thing which is important is to remember that the ELS continue to develop their oral language and vocabulary while they're also learning to read. So again, it goes back to this notion that sometimes you develop vocabulary by reading, and the vice versa. The two have kind of reciprocal relationship, the reading and language development. Okay. So when we look at academic vocabulary, kind of deep knowledge of language, of vocabulary, one of the things that researchers both in the States and in Canada have shown that there's actually kind of a common sequence of academic vocabulary development. An example, if you look at the two examples below, that will kind of demonstrate the point I'm trying to make. So if you look at the word arm and the word translucent, both of them are what we would call academic vocabulary. The word arm is typically acquired, and we know that from research, is typically acquired around grade 2. So for monolingual children, more or less around grade 2, children learn the meaning and sometimes the various meanings of the word arm. The word translucent is a word that's learned much later, probably in high school. So, and one of the things that I'm going back to this point about the order is it's absolutely unlikely that a kid will know the meaning of the word translucent and not know the word arm, because the word arm is typically acquired around grade 2, whereas the word translucent is not so frequent in our language, and if you see it in science, for instance, or maybe when you read some poetry, it will be in a high school level you see that word. So these are some of the principles that we've learned from other research. And in the next slide, I'm going to show you an example of a study we did where we took that information and tried it. Remember I mentioned earlier the kids in the Regent Park in Toronto where they were exposed to the Pathways to Education program. So these are kids, adolescent kids, and we tried with them items such as these. Johnny fell and broke his arm. What does the word mean? Arm mean? The material is translucent. What does the word translucent mean? And so what I'm showing you here is an example of a study we did with this high school adolescents who are all ELLs. And what I'm showing you is at the bottom line are academic words which are children who are monolinguals already have learned in grade 2. And where it says grade 4, these are words that are typically acquired in grade 4. And grade 12 is words that are typically acquired in grade 12. Okay? Now, the children that we are looking at were adolescents who are all in grade 10. And what you see is that they know about less than half of the words that monolingual children know that are typical academic vocabulary words for grade 10. So let me repeat this, okay? The ELLs are familiar with half or less than half of the academic vocabulary that monolingual children in the same classroom are familiar with. Think about what does that mean for your ability to comprehend text and for write essays when there's so many words on the page that you're not familiar with, and it has implications for teaching vocabulary. Okay, so let's move on. Another thing that when we look at vocabulary, and again, I don't have the time to give you more examples of this, but if we look at the teaching of vocabulary, there are different ways that we make words. So one has to do with understanding of inflections. So, for instance, in English, it would be the difference between boy and boys. But again, if we're looking at Chinese, for instance, in Chinese, you don't mark the plurality. There's no particular letter that marks plurality. So in Chinese, you say many boy. Okay, so if I translate from Chinese to English, it will be many boy. So for Chinese kids, for instance, it may be harder to learn how to mark plurality with the S because they don't have it in Chinese, as an example. Okay, if we look at derivation, it's another way that we make words. So construct, construction, constructive, etc. Again, we talked earlier about transfer. Think about if you speak Spanish, that may be much easier for you to do than if you come from Chinese, because there are no derivations in Chinese at all. So you may have in your same classroom some kids who speak Spanish at home and some who speak Chinese at home, and the Spanish-speaking kids might be able to use the knowledge of their first language and move more easily between constructive, whereas for the Chinese children, each of those may appear as a separate word. They will not see the commonality between those words because that's not the way their first language works. Okay? So the derivation, so this is an example how we tested the derivational awareness, and I'm going to skip that now. Another way that we make words is by compounding. So for instance, if you think of the word cupcake, it consists of cup plus cake, and turns out that's exactly how they do it in Chinese. So there was one study, which I'm not going to talk about today, where we found that the Chinese kids actually did extremely well on new words which are compounds, because they could transfer, if you wish, their understanding of how we do compounding in Chinese and use it successfully in English. Okay? So it doesn't mean that everything is harder for the Chinese kids, because the compounding in Chinese helped them. And not only that, but most of the words in Chinese are compounds. So they can, it's a skill that is very well established with Chinese children, and they can use it when they learn compounding words in English. Okay, so what have we talked about about vocabulary today? I just want to summarize, to recap. What I said is, from a developmental perspective, that there's a common sequence of vocabulary knowledge, and that is true both for monolingual and for ELLs, that it's very useful to distinguish between everyday and academic vocabulary. The other thing that we've learned is actually that vocabulary takes a long time to develop, and that it requires intensive and ongoing instruction exposure. We mentioned briefly the issue of typology, that different languages vary in how they make words. What I didn't talk about today is how there are individual differences among children. So for instance, if you have better what we call phonological short-term memory, it's easier for you to learn new words, regardless of the language that you're studying. We also know that context is important, so the age of the learners. I did not talk today about parental education, but it does play a role. And the instructional approaches. So, and what we know from recent research, some of it coming from people like Noni Lezo at Harvard University, for instance, is how important it is to use very explicit instructional approaches to teach language. It's not just about exposure. Exposure is important, but there are some key points that have to be made explicit in the classroom. So, I'm moving now to talk about phonological awareness. As I mentioned earlier, we know that phonological awareness is an important component of being able to learn to read words. And what it is, what it involves is awareness that words consist of phonemes, or what some people kind of in everyday language used to refer to as sounds. We know that it's crucial to develop decoding skills in a variety of alphabetic languages, and we know that it also contributes to the development of vocabulary. And what it is a meta-linguistic skill that can cut across languages. So I want to explain what I mean by that. Let's say that you speak Russian, and that you understand, you know how to take words in Russian and say this is the first sound in the word and this is the last sound in the word, and I can remove this sound and replace it with another one. So in other words, you understand you can manipulate the components of words. Once you understand that, you can use it in any other language you're learning. You don't have to learn it anew for Spanish and Arabic and Russian. Once you know it in one language, that kind of meta-linguistic developmental understanding is something that stays with you, and you can use it in any other language you're going to learn. And what I'm showing you in the second part of this slide are some ways that we assess that. And it could be done formally or informally. So an example might be, for instance, the first one is an easy one. Say cowboy. Now I say it without the cow, so hopefully the kid says boy. Here's another one which we use often with very young children. So we say boy, toy, bag. Which one begins with a different sound? So you don't have to know how to read, but you can hear the two of the words have the b sound in them, and one has the t sound in them. Here's one that we use, it appears in a number of the tests that we use. So we say to a kid, this is an example, say stop. Now say it without the s. So can the kids say, hopefully they will say stop, but some kids may not be able to do that. And that becomes, and we give children a test which involve items like this one, words like this one, and kids who have difficulty in that have difficulty in decoding words. Okay? Let's move on. So this is an example from the same study, the big study that I'm talking to you about, where we followed the children for 6 years. And what we found is that the ability to do a phonological awareness test, so that this is an example of that would be like the word stop here, say stop, and I'll say it without a s. And so ability to do that kind of a task, actually, children can do that even if they don't speak English well. And what this graph is showing you, that actually the development of this ability is exactly the same for the monolingual children and the ELL kids sitting in the same classroom. Okay? So even though you might think that, oh, if you come from Chinese, you can't do that, it turns out it doesn't matter, that it's an underlying linguistics, as I said, a mental linguistic skill. If you have it, you can use it even though you don't know the meaning of the words. So that's an important finding, which actually helps us when we do assessment of kids who may also have learning disabilities. We're talking about this whole notion of transfer. So let's look at some of the kind of early stage second language literacy development and how you can, if you have it in the L1, how it can help you with the second language. So one is the letter sound, as I said. If you understand that the relationship between letters and sound in one language, it can help you in English as well. This is, of course, will be true for alphabetic languages. Let's say use the same alphabet. The phonological awareness, I've just given you an example where I've shown you that actually the development over time does not matter. It does not depend on whether you speak the language well or not. Knowing many words in language can help you with knowing many words in the other language. We also know from research that actually learning to decode words, if you're good at that in one language, you're good at that in the other language. And the same is true for print awareness. So I want to show you here an example from one study. Now, I know that some of you maybe you don't know statistics, so I'll try to explain in a way that's meaningful. This comes from a study that was done in Toronto where the children were French immersion. They were in French immersion. The way French immersion works in Canada is that children who typically speak English at home, and they typically are middle-class children, as of age 5, they're exposed, they go to school where the teacher only speaks French the whole day. So they're not getting any instruction in English in the first few years. It's only done in French, and that's the whole idea of immersion, that they're immersed in French. And what I'm showing you here is, I'll just show you a few of the results of this study. So in this particular study, we tested the children. When they were 5 years old, we tested them in English. So this is before they started to learn French. And then we look at their reading skills a year later. But at that time, they're at the end of grade 1, and they've only been learning to read in French in grade 1. So let's see what happens. This one is showing us that those kids who are better able in the senior kindergarten, when they're 5, to say what sounds the different letters of the alphabet make, were much better at reading words in French a year later. So we can actually predict who will be a good word reader in grade 1 in French on the basis of their ability to tell the letter sound correspondences a year earlier, which was in English. Here's another an example, which is very powerful. This is phonological awareness. So here what we're looking at is we're asking the kids, remember the stop example. Say stop, now say it without the s, okay? So it's that kind of a task done in English when they're 5 years old, and you look at how they read words in French a year later. And the correlation is 0.63, which means it's a very high correlation. It means that those kids who are very good at this task in English when they're 5 are better at reading words in French in grade 1. And those kids who have difficulty with this task when they're 5, tested in English, are the ones who will have difficulties in reading words in French a year later. And the last example I want to show from this particular table is that it also is related to story reading in French. Now, I could have given you an example from Spanish. There are studies that were done between English and Spanish in the United States, very similar results. So this is telling us that once you have this phonological awareness, it predicts word reading, and it can do it cross-linguistically. So it can, for instance, we can point to kids who may need some extra instruction, so they're ready to learn to read in the second language because they need more strengthening of their phonological awareness skills, strengthening of their ability to say what sounds that each of the letters make. So these are some of the instructional implications. Okay, so what then have we learned about phonological awareness? That it's crucial for learning to decode, and it's true across different languages, by the way, including Chinese, and that there is transfer. I didn't actually talk about it today because we don't have time, and so I want to move on. So what I'm moving on to now is word level reading. And again, we're looking at the same project with kids that we've followed for a number of years. But before I do that, I want to just kind of wake you up in case you're falling asleep. So let's look at the word universe. So have you ever seen the word universe before? I actually haven't, so I don't know how many of you have seen it, but most of the people I asked have not seen it before. It's a real word in English. To read it, if you have never seen it before, you will have to decode the word, right? So you have to be able to do letter-sound correspondences. The word universe is a bit more complex. It has this OU after the R, which is difficult in English, so we have to learn how to pronounce it. Okay, now let's go to higher level. Can you figure out what it might mean? Well, most of you, I'm assuming, know what the word uni means. And maybe you have not seen universe before, but you have seen other words which have the verse ending in it. So you might be able, by first decoding the word and then doing a morphological analysis, you can actually figure out what the word means. Okay, so that's the kind of thing that we do because we're good readers. And what we want is for children to learn how to do that as well, which would mean they will need to learn how to decode the words, and we also need to teach them how to look at morphemes, which are a meaningful unit within that word, like uni and verse in this case. So going back to this longitudinal study with our ESL kids, here's an example. On the left, I'm showing you the development of word reading skills in these kids from grade 1 to grade 6. And on the right, I'm showing you how they do a task where they see non-words. So they're not real words in English, and they have to decode them. And it turns out, as you see, that both on decoding of pseudo-words, non-words, not real words in English, as well as when we show them real words in English, they develop at the same pace, even though they clearly are ESL kids. You remember the first graph I showed you about their vocabulary. They definitely know less English than the monolingual children, but just reading the words is not an issue, and they can learn to do that even when they don't know the language so well. What does that tell you? Let's kind of recap. Word level reading and spelling are less dependent on language proficiency. They are related to phonological awareness and to orthographic skills, and typically developing ELLs do not differ from the monolingual skills on that part. So even though they're ELLs, they can still learn it. We've also learned, I did not show you much of that today, but there is a transfer. It is easier to decode in irregular orthography. So for instance, it's easier to learn to decode in Spanish than it is in English. That we have shown in some of our studies, and other people have shown that as well, that certain errors that the kids make actually reflect the fact that what we would call negative transfer from the first language. So transfer definitely plays a role, but what we see also is that for typically developing children, those errors that reflect kind of the negative transfer from the first language gradually disappear. The other thing which we found that has very important instructional implications is that error analysis is very important. Again, I did not show you examples today, but let's just take as an example. Let's say that I asked a kid to spell the word cat. So, of course, the correct spelling will be C-A-T. We may have a kid who will just write the first letter, maybe the first sound, so they'll write the sound. They'll write the letter K because they hear the K and cat. Another kid may write cat K-E-T. K-E-T is much more sophisticated than just cat. The K, because if somebody writes K-E-T for cat, they already represent each of the sounds in the word cat. It's not correct, but they already understand that they have to represent each of the sounds. So you see how error analysis can be extremely informative when we engage in assessment and in instruction. Okay, now we go to the bigger picture, reading comprehension. Reading comprehension is a very complex task, and I'm going to skip this slide, and you can read it later if you have nothing better to read. It's a very complex task. It has many components to it, and we can assess it in different ways. What I would like to share with you is this chart, which shows what happens with the same children that I've talked about for the last 10 minutes, who have poor vocabulary, but when you look at their ability to decode words, they're not behind. We look at their ability to do phonological awareness, they're not behind. Look at what happens when you assess them on reading comprehension. So what you see here, the orange line shows the ELLs and the monolinguals in grade 4, and there's a big difference. It's a significant difference between them in their ability to comprehend text. And when we look at them on the same test 3 years later, the gap between the monolinguals and the ELLs is actually larger than it was in grade 4. So this is where our challenge is as researchers and as teachers. Why is the gap bigger? Can we make it smaller? What we think is one of the challenges is actually with the academic language. And we've recently been doing studies where we actually try to boost their knowledge of academic language, because we think that's where they fall behind. Because they don't have the problems with decoding, but we think that it's the language demands of the text that they have to read, which prevents them from doing as well as the monolingual kids. This finding also, I think, has important implications for some of the state tests and assessments that you do in the states, in various states. And I'm not familiar with all the different ways you measure that, but I know that you have these state assessments, and what you see, this kind of results suggest that we should have actually different norms for the monolingual children and the ELL kids. That if we want to see who's a good comprehender and who's a poor comprehender, we have to look at it in relation to whether they're ELL or not ELL. And I know that that's a whole big other topic, but which we can talk about another time. But these are some of the implications. Okay. So Elizabeth, I think we won't have much time to talk about the LD, or shall we just skip some of that? What do you think?
I think it would be good to just touch on it, at a high level maybe, and we can still get through most of the rest, I think, if we go a little quickly.
Okay. You mean you want me to talk even faster than I do? That's not a good idea. Okay. We'll see. Okay, what I'm showing you in this graph, just so those of you who are not so familiar with research, is to sort of appreciate what we mean when we talk about the relationship between language and reading and decoding and reading. So this, each of those little X's is a kid, and you can see that you have some kids who are ELLs who have relatively more vocabulary and are better comprehenders, and those who have fewer vocabulary items are poor comprehenders. And that is true both for the monolinguals, or the blue X's, and for the red ones who are the ELLs. So this is just to make it more concrete for those of you who are not familiar with research, so you understand what I'm talking about. This particular, again, it's what we call a scatter plot. It shows for the same children, and this time what we're looking at the reading comprehension and the ability to decode. And again, you see that those kids in the green line here, the green circle, are the kids who are poor decoders and they're poor comprehenders, whereas the kids where you see this kind of blue circle at the top are the kids who are good decoders and good comprehenders. So you see how, if you think of these two charts together, it's what gives us the simple view of reading, right? That you have to be, if you're a good decoder and you have good language, you're better likely to do well in comprehension than you are if you're poor in both. Okay. Whoops. Okay. So, and again, and one of you actually sent a question about it yesterday. What about ELLs who begin to learn English as adolescents? Well, what we know from research is that both decoding and language are associated with comprehension of ELLs. So there's a study, a very nice study, you have the reference at the bottom there, where they looked at high school kids who came to Canada only a year or two earlier. And it turned out that for these kids, both vocabulary and decoding in high school were related to their ability to read, to comprehend, whereas for monolingual children, by the time they're in grade 9, they usually have good word reading skills. So word reading don't play a role anymore in comprehension. It's only about language. That's the case usually for monolinguals. But what this study is showing that for grade high school kids who have come recently, even their decoding is still not fluent, and it contributes to their difficulties in comprehension. I think it's a very important study because it emphasizes, again, this issue, not all ELLs are the same. Did they come in grade 1? Did they come in grade 8? If they came in grade 8, did they were they in a refugee camp? If they were in a refugee camp, they haven't learned to read in either language. Maybe they already learned to read in their first language, but they don't know how to decode in English. So we need to teach them how to decode. And so what it means is that we need that high school teachers, for instance, need to also know about decoding. It's not only about teaching language or teaching the subject matter that you may have in your classroom some kids who are having difficulty with decoding the words, and they don't finish a standardized test because they read very slowly because they're not fluent decoders, on top of also not knowing the language. So there's a whole bunch of implications of this kind of a study, and that we really have to look at physics teachers need to know about decoding, not only English teachers. So that's, I think, one of the implications of the many. Okay. So
I think that's a good lead into the next question. If you want to quickly get on this slide 62, and then we'll get into the question for our participants.
Yes, okay. So what I want to recap here of what, so it's kind of a summary of what I've talked about in the last 10 minutes, that when we look at some of the basic skills such as rapid naming, phonological awareness, memory, word reading, we actually don't find big differences between the monolingual and the ELLs. Where we find differences is in vocabulary, is in grammar. So these are the two ways of thinking about language proficiency. And we do find differences in reading comprehension as well. Okay? So it's not that poor in everything. They may be good on some, but on some of the higher level aspects, they still continue to be behind. Okay, that's a summary. So there was a question? What's the question?
Yes, here we are. So we've talked a lot over the last several slides about several of these different approaches to looking at teaching English language learners. So now we'd like to open it up for folks to share your own challenges in instruction and some strategies, hopefully, for overcoming these challenges. So we're going to put that poll up and allow you to share some of your ideas and what has worked well for you. And then, Esther, I'm going to refer you over to the parking lot because we had a few questions come in as you were going through that section. Some were a little further back than others. Leah was asking about how does reading impact math academic levels. And I think you might have touched on this, but I don't know if you want to say anything further.
Yeah, I mean, definitely reading impacts math academic level. Well, the question is what do we mean by math academic level? But definitely where we see the impact of reading and language is on word level skills. So we don't usually see that reading is directly related to the ability to do calculations, kind of the basic operations, but as soon as you involve word problems, then you have to be able to read. And so some kids may not be able to do well on math, not because they don't understand the mathematical principles, but because they are stuck with decoding problems. So that's one thing that needs to be that we need to be aware of. I would like to add to Leah's question, actually, the other component, and that's especially true with the ELLs, is it's possible that you actually don't have reading problems in the sense that you can read all the words on the page, but you don't know what is the meaning of some of the words. Think of some of the ways that we ask questions in math. So, for instance, if statements, right? If you look at probability problems, we use if statements. Well, do the learners understand? Do they know English to understand how we construct if statements in English? It could be that they actually are very good at probabilities, but they don't understand the question. Okay, so it's both the language part and the reading part, which will play a role. At the same time, we see that, again, depending on the country kids come from. I mean, from certain countries, when they come to Canada, the math skills are actually better than the math skills of the local kids because they come from countries where math is taught in a more rigorous way. So sometimes they do better.
Great. So, we're kind of coming up on the end of our time, so we're going to move through some of these next parts a little quickly. I see folks are still typing, so let's take the opportunity to just glance through the responses that are here and some of the challenges that folks might have in teaching literacy.
Okay. Okay, so the idea of read it, draw it, solve it is yeah, it's good. That's a generally good strategy. What do you do if you have problems in decoding, though, right? Or what if you have problems with spatial representation? So for some of those children, I would read the problem to them. If we want to see if they understand how to solve math problems, then it should not be a reading test. It should be a test about their understanding of mathematical concepts, not about reading. Yeah.
I see a couple of response related to problem solving, and then Leah also asked another question about problem solving. I think some of this relates to your response in reference to the math question.
Yeah.
And I know you and I had talked about this in advance of the webinar, that whether students come with the problem solving skills in their problem solving is just a general ability, not necessarily a language specific.
That's right. So and I think I mentioned that 1 or 2 times in my talk that if you're a good reader in Arabic in your school and you comprehend the text, that, I don't know, science, let's say, when you're studying science in Arabic, then you know how to identify the main idea and how to draw inferences, then you should be able to do that also in English once you've learned enough of the language. So you don't have to learn this anew. Whereas if I have the time, I'm going to show you an example of a study where we show that some kids actually have difficulties in drawing inferences, and it's not about being ELLs. It's about the fact that just having difficulties in drawing inferences, which has to do with language impairment. So not all learners have the same reason why they're having difficulty. And as teachers and as educators, we need to figure out what's the source of the difficulty. So one size does not fit all, I would say.
Very good. Well, in the interest of time, our next section is intended to address the language and reading of English language learners who are at risk for learning difficulties. I don't think we're going to have time to get through all the slides in that section, no, unfortunately. So I don't know, Esther, if you want to give a high-level synopsis.
I'll try to give a high level. So basically, one of the things that I've been trying to do for many years now is to see how we can tease apart this problem that some kids just don't speak English well from the possibility that in addition to not speaking English well, they have a learning disability. And what we've seen over the years is evidence for both for over-identification, where too many ELLs were identified as being, for instance, slow learners. At the same time, in Canada, we've seen also the opposite, where teachers see that the children have problems, but they attribute the problems only to the fact that they're ELLs, when in fact some of them actually, in addition to being ELLs, have a problem such as dyslexia, which has to do with difficulties in decoding words. So what I would like to do actually is to show you this chart, which is one of my favorites actually. And we published this study many years ago, and it was based on the same project that I was just talking about all along. And what I'm showing you here, and basically we had ELLs and monolingual kids, and on the basis of their decoding skills and their phonological awareness and their rapid naming, we said some of those kids are doing much more poorly than other ELLs. Or here are some kids are doing much more poorly than the monolingual peers. So we compare the ELLs to the ELLs and the monolinguals to the monolinguals, those who don't have a problem and those who appear to have serious difficulties. And what this chart is showing you is that, in fact, the profiles of the monolingual kids and the ELL kids who had decoding problems were very similar to each other. So if you look, for instance, in the first red circle with the one that says phonological awareness, it showed that kids who are above the zero line, the zero line is like the average, okay? And the kids who are above average are monolinguals who don't have a problem, or ELLs who have no problem decoding. And the yellow and green show monolinguals who have decoding problems and ELLs who have decoding problems. And what we see is that on phonological awareness and on rapid naming, which is another of the indicators of having dyslexia, and the other red line here at the very right, the ability to read words at the end of grade 2 are very similar to each other. So we see that we can see both monolinguals and ELLs who have no problems in decoding, and we can see some ELLs, in addition to being ELLs, also have problems in decoding. And in fact, the cognitive profiles are very similar to each other. And what the outcome, the implications of this is, and this is what we're doing now in our clinic, in our lab, is we can identify kids who have decoding problems early, and we can then provide them with interventions. We don't have to wait until 5 or 6 years later when people realize, oh my goodness, this kid is not just ELL, they also have reading problems. Well, by now you have a 13-year-old who's angry and is ready to drop out of school. So these are some of the implications of this kind of a study. So I think that I'm going to stop here. Maybe to summarize, so I'm going to summarize this slide, which summarizes what I said. So ELLs are ELLs. They continue to lag on language skills. At the same time, if they have a dyslexia, so the dyslexia has to do with difficulty with reading words, their profiles are very similar to those of monolinguals. And as instructors, I would say, if you see kids who have persistent difficulties in decoding words, you cannot just say it's because they speak another language at home. Because I've shown you, I think, for the last 2 hours today, that actually learning to decode words does not depend on the language proficiency. But some of the kids have difficulties in decoding because they have kind of cognitive reasons why they have that problem, and that those difficulties are similar for the monolinguals and the ESLs. So maybe I'll stop here. I think that the other slides, well, some of you may be able to just figure it out on your own. And then what we have, this is what we have towards the end are okay, maybe I'll just say something about the interventions. We have somewhat less research on interventions of children who are ELLs and have learning difficulties, but the studies that we have, some of them coming from Texas, some of them coming from Toronto actually, show that you can use exactly the same approaches to address the learning difficulties with a monolingual or ESLs. That's sort of a very general summary that I'm providing you here. So you don't need to say, oh, we have these kids who can't learn how to read, and they're ELLs, but we don't have the specialists to deal with ELLs. If you have a specialist who knows how to deal with reading difficulties, that specialist should be able to work with the ELLs as well, because the same approaches help both groups. Okay, so maybe. Okay, so now the implications part, I don't think we can talk about, right? So what do you say, Elizabeth?
I think what we might want to say is if we can give one tip, people can read the slides once you download the PowerPoint, but one tip for each group. So what do teachers need to know? What do parents need to know?
Okay, so let's do, okay, so in terms of teachers, I would say it's useful to assess in the L1 and the L2 when it's feasible. That's related to one of the questions that somebody asked. We are strong believers in the use of technology, assistive technology to help students, and it should help equally for the monolinguals and the ELLs. So these are two of the points I'll talk about for teachers. The other thing which, okay, maybe we'll, I think that the points on this slide are very clear, and you should just read them, and I think you'll know what I mean, so I'm going to move on. Parents, what are the suggestions for parents of children who have a learning disability as well? Find somebody who can help them with the decoding. Another important thing to be aware of is actually at this point that if your child does not know the meaning of 97% of the words on the page, the text is too difficult. So that's something that's relevant both for teachers and for parents, that we need to be aware. And just go into the dictionary. If you have to go for the dictionary for more than 3% of the words on the page, it's very hard to follow and remember what you've read. So that's one practical advice that I would give. Again, using assistive technology, there are some fantastic things out there now in the market in terms of helping children who need to learn. Okay, principles. The first point is kind of obvious, no need to linger on that. I would say professional development of teachers is an important one. And I would say not only the English teachers, but also the teachers of other content area subjects. Everybody needs to know about what are the challenges of the ELLs in the classroom, because they're not all the same. Policymakers. Yes, stay up to date on research, absolutely. Invite Esther Geva to give talks. And yeah, develop programs that support ELLs throughout their educational career. I think is really important across the lifespan, both elementary and secondary, and programs that, what else would I say? Well, I think it's all important, so maybe I'll stop with that. Okay, and this is, I think, maybe the last slide, and it's 5 o'clock in Toronto. These are two books that happen to be published in the same year. The one on the right with Judy Weiner is written for psychologists and speech and language pathologists. That some teachers tell us it's also very useful. The focus is on children who come from diverse backgrounds and who have various needs and how to assess them. The book on the left, Focus on Reading, which just came out 2 weeks ago, focuses on various principles of teaching reading to ELLs. So there you go. I'm done. Hello?
I can hear you, Esther.
Yeah, okay, good.
Yep. I don't know what's happening. You're going in and out.
Oh, okay. Are we continuing? Because I thought we ran out of time. Is that?
So I'm going to, we'll share this slide, make sure people get a capture of those resources. I'm going to advance so they can see this slide. And I want to make sure we use a few minutes. I know we're over time, but for folks who are still hanging with us, I want to make sure that we give them an opportunity to share some of their takeaways. So here, if you want to just take 1 minute to synthesize the big picture from today's session.
Okay. So I think what I would try to get across today is that various factors influence the needs of ELLs. Again, it's this notion that it's not one size fits all, that there are certain instructional practices that support ELLs, in particular in the area of language would be one area, development of language fluency, reading fluency, which I did not talk much about today. There are various instructional practices, which we actually talk about in the book with Gloria. And that their stakeholders are really involved in supporting ELLs. It's parents, it's teachers, it's policymakers, it's principals. And I would say also psychologists, because as one of the questions that was earlier, we also need to be aware of the social-emotional needs of kids who come from different backgrounds and acknowledge cultural differences. So that will be a whole other talk. And another thing which is really important is to be aware of age and of when they arrive from the other country, and what is their educational history. So somebody who's been in school in Bosnia until a month ago, his needs are very different from somebody who's been in a refugee camp in Africa for the last 5 years, and we have to address the needs of both kinds of learners. And the other thing which is the transfer, because a lot of people, when they think about second language, talk about transfer, and the most frequent one I hear is about cognates, but we have to remember that yes, there is transfer, and it can be both positive and negative, and it's not all the same elements that apply to all learners. It depends on what is their first language background.
Wonderful. Thank you for rushing through those last slides. I know it's valuable to folks, and seeing the comments already in the parking lot. I want to, at this moment, get one last poll up and ask folks for their takeaways. What we intend for this series to be something that you can take action on in your role. So what will you take away from today's presentation and take back to the place where you work with students or educators? And the ideas that you share might be useful to others, so that's why we ask for this, so you can think about what you plan to do and share those ideas with others. While we put those polls up, I will go through a few other housekeeping items. Even though you won't see them on the slides at the moment, I'll let you know that our contact information is on slide 85. So if you have questions in general about the webinar series, feel free to reach out to me. If you have any questions specifically on this topic, you can feel free to reach out to Dr. Geva, and her email address is there. We do have one last webinar for this year's series. It will be on December 3rd in just a few weeks, and we'll be addressing the effective integration of technology in instruction with Michael J. And so we hope you'll come back for that exciting session, and then you can look forward to our series beginning again in the spring, and we'll be addressing a whole new set of topics. Because we're now in our third year of this series, and this is intended to be very practitioner focused and reaching those of you who are out in schools and districts working with students and teachers, we want to make sure that we're meeting your needs. So we do hope you'll take a few moments to respond to our survey. I'm going to pop that up for you right now. And we value your feedback. We really do want to know what you would be interested in learning more about if we haven't addressed it already. And tell us, what we're doing well and where we could improve. So that said, we are over time. I want to make sure that Esther has a moment to glance at the takeaways that you all have generated here.
I actually don't see that screen now.
Okay. So maybe I can just summarize. A few have come in. Some of the detailed information about the issues that ELs are facing. It's great to learn about those. The importance of delivering interventions early. The various research and the studies that you shared. Check students' decoding skills and their reading comprehension. Help them build their academic knowledge. Folks are saying they plan to share with colleagues. As I mentioned earlier, this webinar, the archive, will be available. I probably spoke out of error in saying it will be ready in 1 week. It will be more closely to 2 or 3 weeks. But do look back for that, and as I mentioned, you'll be receiving an email indicating when that's ready. Folks are looking forward to reading your books.
Okay.
So at this time, I want to make sure we give a nice virtual round of applause to Dr. Geva. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Thank you for sharing the resources and the knowledge that you've put forth today in the webinar. And I know there's still much more we could be touching on in another several hours, but it was a great introduction for many.
Thank you. This was my first webinar, so it was an interesting experience.
Wonderful. Well, we're pleased to have had the opportunity to work with you, and it sounds like from the parking lot, lots of accolades for today's presentation. So We're appreciative of all of you who came and shared the last 2 hours with us, and we hope you all have a great evening and hope to see you back for one of our future webinars.
Thank you.